obeyed that. Don't try and do that, right? Don't try and move up the system. In fact, stay where you are. In fact, Paul picks that up and says stuff like, stay in the station or position in which you were converted. Say that? Now, Brother Peter says of Brother Paul says some strange things that are very hard to understand. But let me quote what Brother Paul, who's hard to understand, says about this. He said in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 20, everyone should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. So if you're at the top, stay at the top. If you're at the bottom, stay at the bottom. If you're in the middle, stay in the middle. Don't try and move up the system. Did you know he said that? It's interesting, isn't it? In case you don't get it, he says, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. So it's explicitly talking to slaves. Don't try to become a master. That's okay. But then he says something really strange, and I'm sure this perplexed Peter, among other people. He says, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. So he's saying, don't move up the system. If you're a slave, you don't have to become a master. If you're at the bottom, you don't have to become the top. But if you can gain your freedom, do so. So where do you gain your freedom without moving from the bottom to the top? That's the interesting question. And the answer is?
Neutrality.
No. Thank you for trying. Where is, if the room to move is not by going from the bottom to top, where is the room to move in that structure? Yes! By going from the centre to the periphery. Wherever you are, that's where the space is. In the short term, while Jesus is reframing hierarchies in terms of mutuality in his society, he and his friends are moving from the centre to the periphery, far enough away from the dominant structures of the day that they don't control them, but close enough that they can influence them. Isn't that what he did? So he'd turn up at the synagogue and speak, and then he and his disciples would move to the side and experiment on the side with the kind of things that he hoped the synagogue would take on in due time. And Paul did the same. Paul took that strategy and he would move into an area. He didn't join the synagogue and become one of the leaders of a synagogue. He took up a role on the side as a tent maker. On the edge of the system, supporting himself far enough away from the synagogue that it couldn't control him, but close enough that he could influence it. Do you get it? You understand that? Now, this is highly significant. For those of you, particularly that are pastors, this is very important. If you have managed to get to the top and you believe in the kind of changes that we're advocating today about community, the temptation is to try and impose them from the top. But you can bet your bottom dollar people will resist you. Right? And the conundrum is that is contrary to what you're trying to develop anyway. Because you're trying to develop a system that's mutual, not hierarchical, and yet you're using hierarchy to impose mutuality. You understand what I'm saying? So what do? Well, what you do is you move to the side, like the people at every position in the hierarchy. That's where you move. You move to the side and you develop an ecclesia like Paul that models the alternative you long for in the structure, that's far enough away from the structure that if it fails, people can disown it, but close enough that if it succeeds, they can own it, so they win both ways, and therefore they're not going to resist you. Do you understand that? In other words, you give yourself a reasonable chance of developing an alternative experiment that's close enough to that structure that it might impact it without imposing it on anybody. Do you get the idea? It's not about radicals imposing their agenda instead of conservatives. It's about nobody imposing their agenda. Are you clear? No, it's very important. It's not regime change, it's system change. Right? It's about not developing a bigger, better institution. It's about developing community instead of institutions. Do you understand that? Is that clear? So, I'm going to give you an example now. So, when we joined St Andrews, we didn't join the parish council and then develop proposals that they would then support and run as a church program. Because we felt it would take a long time to get into that position, it takes a lot of energy to try and process it. Often then it gets so modified by that process, the program doesn't end up being exactly what you wanted to do in the first place, and you don't have much energy left to actually make it happen when you get there. Do you understand? Okay, people are familiar with that. So what we did was just move to the side, and we started to do on the side the kind of things that we hoped one day the church would take on. So we began visiting people in the community who were people living in hostels, boarding houses, in public housing, particularly people with a range of disabilities, intellectual, physical, psychiatric disabilities, and we would visit them. And we would go on outings with them because they just wanted to get out and do something different. And then people said, you know, what they'd like to do is meet together regularly and eat together regularly. So we started developing community meals, where once a fortnight we just came together and had a meal together. Now, again, we didn't want to provide this as a service, us to them, like a soup kitchen. We said, everybody bring food and share it. Those that have a lot, bring a lot. Those that bring a little, bring a little, but all of us bring something to share. So we started having these communal meals together, and we've done that for the last 20 years, right? Continued that. And that's really important to people because a lot of people have caseworkers come for a while and then go for a while, and there's not a lot of continuity in people's lives. And just that continuity over the years of meeting with people and eating with them regularly has really been important to people. Now, what we're trying to model is the kind of community engagement that we hope the church would take on. Now, to begin with, it was not a formal part of the church program. And so we were free to do it without any permission, because we were just people attending church who happened to be doing this, and there was no explicit connection between that community meal and the church. But a few years down the track, the church was contacted by the ABC, and the ABC said, look, we want to do a program on St Andrews. You started Meals on Wheels. That's a great program. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that maybe we could film? And they said, oh, we've got this community meal. We have got this community meal. Now, this is what we're hoping, that they will own it, right? It's not being imposed on them, but it's being offered to them as an option. No, we weren't. And because that's a problem, doing stuff in church buildings, because, you know, people mess stuff up, and people so impose rules, regulations, health and safety. Anyway, so we were just doing it. And they came to us and said, look, can we do some filming of the community meal? So we said, oh, we don't know, we'll just ask people, right? And so we went to community meal and said, what do you want to do? Do you want to do this? I said, oh yeah, you know, this would be great. We'll get on TV. So that became explicitly connected to St Andrews, even though St Andrews had no involvement in initiating it or organising it or running it. Okay? Now, the challenge is where you go with that next. Our hope is that sooner or later, that little community meal experiment would be brought into the church, and that would be a catalyst for community in the context of the institution. Because the dynamics of it are about mutuality rather than about hierarchy. But the temptation is to bring it from the periphery to the centre too quickly. If you bring your little kind of community experiment, community meal in to this too quickly, what happens is you bring it in there and it gets squeezed into that space. It becomes a church program. The church imposes on it their own rules and regulations, their own means and methods of operation, which normally take the power away from the people that are running it, which destroys it as a community experiment. People familiar with that? People understand what I'm talking about? Okay. So the important thing is, even though you're hoping and praying to bring that back in here as a catalyst for change, the important thing is not to bring it back in too quickly. Is that clear? Okay. What you've got to hope for and pray for is that sooner or later there's a breakdown in the church. That creates a space that you can bring this into without it being squeezed like a round peg into a square hole. So you can bring it in with integrity, and it can be as it is in the context of that structure. And the great thing is, the good news is that churches are always having splits. The good news is that they're always having divisions. The good news is things are always breaking down. The good things is they're always cracking up. Right? If a thing ain't broke, you can't fix it. The hardest churches to change are the ones that are successful. It's true. It's true. Fortunately, a lot fail. Right? And this creates the opportunity for you to bring your experiments in to the church. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. So what happened here was that the minister, John Arnold, was going on sabbatical, and he talked to a lot of people about taking over the evening service. And he couldn't find anybody to do it. And eventually he came to me and a few of my friends and said, would you mind taking over the evening service? So we said to him, we'd be interested, but on certain conditions. And he said, what's that? We said, first of all, we'd want it in the basement, not in the sanctuary. He said, fine. And we said, we would like to all sit in a circle to emphasise our equality. Not in rows. And he said, fine. We said, we would like anybody who came to be free to lead the service. He said, fine. We would like to invite anybody who wanted to share the word. And he said, fine. And he said, but there's one thing. He said, you're Baptist. I know you're not into liturgy, but we're an Anglican church. Could we have a liturgy? And I said, fine. As long as we can change it every week. And he said, fine. Now, do you understand what's happened here? Now we can bring that community meal in to the context of the church structure and keep the integrity of the mutuality. Do you understand that? Right? It can be true to what it is as a community in the institution. Right? So all those people who were coming to the community meal started coming to church, coming into the basement. We're all sitting in a circle. We're all participating in a worship life together. We have an open time of prayer. People can pray whatever they like. People cry out to God for all kinds of things. And we just pray liturgically, Lord, hear our prayer. So, God, I need a cigarette. Lord, hear our prayer. Need more sex. Lord, hear our prayer. I think I was telling people last time I was here, people pray for sex, some people pray against it, you know. I can remember one night this woman says, could you tell Fred over there I don't want sex with him anymore? And everybody in the room but Fred said, Lord, hear our prayer. Okay. So we just have a time where people can cry out to God. Right? We have people leading the service and sharing the word. We regularly have people who are semi-literate, who have difficulty reading